Well, church, we've come to the final week of our Stand series, and as I was preparing this week, I began to think about what I hoped would come of this series, and I really just noted three things. I pray that this series has met you with assurance, that as we've walked through this material in Daniel, as we've looked at the different topics of standing out, standing up, standing strong, standing in, and now this week, standing firm, I pray that you have received assurance in your faith. And I also pray that you have been challenged and you've been moved in the necessary areas that you needed to be challenged in. If God wanted to challenge you in some area where He really thought maybe you were sitting and you needed to be standing, I pray that you have been challenged to move. And then finally, I pray that you've been motivated in other areas that you have not yet possessed. Things that God maybe was allowing you to see and that you had not yet possessed yet, and He wanted you to have faith to believe that those things were coming. And so as we've talked this month about standing out, standing up, standing strong, standing in faith, this week we're talking about that time and that space of stress and anxiety, where there's a situation that's difficult, and how we stand firm in the fire. Standing firm in the fire. John 16:33 talks about, in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Church, we know that the reality is that all of us will have trouble. We will all have difficulty. We will all have anxiety. We will all have stress. But the truth of John chapter 16 is that we are to take heart because Christ Jesus has overcome the world. In the story of Daniel that we've been looking at for the past month, it is not just a stressful situation, it is a fiery situation. Let me give you a little background. We find ourselves in Daniel chapter 3 today, and I know we were kind of walking our way through Daniel, and now we're kind of going back to Daniel. And Daniel's actually not even in this story. It's in his book, but Daniel must have been out of town this week because he must have been on a journey, on a business trip, because we just see his three friends, Shad, me, and Abednego, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three friends of Daniel, part of the 75 young men that were brought from Israel over to Babylon to be given this training in order to work in the Babylonian government. So you have three teenagers who are radically obedient and end up in a fiery furnace. That's basically the story in a sentence. You think, well, hey, you just told us a sermon, we can go home now. No, there's a whole lot more I want to tell you about it, so stick with me. Three teenagers, radically obedient, end up in a fiery furnace. But what we need to back up and look at first is this guy named King Nebuchadnezzar. We talked about him in previous weeks. Basically, King Nebi was an egomaniac, and he had gotten to such an egomaniac, he had become such a tyrant and prideful that he created this enormous statue. It was basically a gold-plated statue that was 90 feet tall. It was basically a telephone and a pole and a half tall, but it was only 9 feet wide. So it was this really skinny, tall idol. And basically what he does is he says, listen, I've got 7 departments. I've got 7 departments in my government, and I'm asking everyone to come to this dedication ceremony. So all of my leaders, all my judges, all of the priests, and everybody that's involved in my government, I want them to come to this dedication service. And basically what it is, it's a loyalty check. This guy is insecure, he's an egomaniac, and he's basically having a paranoid pursuit of maintaining his status. When you're insecure, you're constantly checking. And so Nebuchadnezzar's insecure, and he's like, well, I got to make sure, are they still with me? Are they still with me? Are they still with me? And so he's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to build this big statue, and we're going to have this service, and I'm going to check and make sure everybody's been being loyal to me. So I'm going to invite them all over, 7 departments, and Meshach, Shadrach and Abednego are there with all of the leaders because they were given a position in the government. So all were assembled, even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the herald, they call him a herald, it would basically be akin to our press secretary. So President Obama's press secretary, you ever seen? Basically, the press secretary stands up and says, listen, here's what we're going to do. When the music starts playing, I need all of you to bow down, and that'll show us that you're loyal to the king. And so he's looking at the conductor and the press secretary and say, okay, so when I give you the sign, we're going to start playing this beautiful music. And as soon as you hear the beautiful music, we need everyone to fall to the floor. Got it? Good. But he said, oh, before we start playing this music, we need to tell you the consequence if you don't bow down. Daniel chapter 3, verse 6 says, whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. Okay, now, are we ready, conductor? Okay. And so basically, if you don't bow down, you have an appointment with the blazing furnace. So the press secretary motions to the conductor, the music begins, and bodies start hitting the floor. Everybody starts to the floor. Now, I have a question. Did you ever know that guy who did anything and everything to get ahead? He didn't care who he had to step on. He was willing to do whatever it takes to get approval, willing to compromise his convictions. He's willing to set aside everything and everyone in order to feed his ego and get ahead. That's exactly what these 7 departments, these guys, all of these people that were assembled at Nebuchadnezzar's dedication ceremony, all they wanted to do was stay in the good graces of Nebuchadnezzar because they knew Nebuchadnezzar had the power, and if they could simply just make him happy, they would have an easy life. And so they were not leaders, they were slaves. They were blindly following and bowing down, except 3 guys. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They chose to stand firm. Now, as I thought about it this week, I feel like there's 2 options. When you're going to make a decision, when you're going to decide what your attitude is about something, when you're going to decide how you're going to behave, it's basically determined by one of 2 things. Either we are going to determine how we behave or what we think or what we're going to decide by external pressure or internal principle. John MacArthur said that this week. Either you're going to make a decision, you're going to behave a certain way, you're going to have an attitude or a thinking a certain way based on one of 2 things. Either you're going to have external pressure, and that is going to have you go ahead and behave or act or think a certain way, or there's going to be something internal, an internal principle that guides all of those things, your attitude, your behaviors, and your thinking. So it's either external pressure or internal principles. And we see in this story, right? It is the external pressures. These people see Nebuchadnezzar saying, everyone's going to bow. That's an external pressure. That's an external expectation, and everyone bows. They are not led in any way by their internal principles, except for these 3 guys. Now, how common is this today? How common is it to bow to the powers that be? How common is it to be led not by our internal principles, but our external pressures, outside forces, voices, circumstances, expectations that dictate instead of our internal principles of faith and commitment to God? Now, I know that we're in church, and so we know the right answer, right? Yes, right. We're supposed to be led by our internal principles, our faith and our commitment to God. But really the reality is that the external pressures and expectations of this culture and this world are very strong. I read a story this week back in 1980. Then Governor Ronald Reagan was running for president, and he was on the campaign trail, and it was in January of 1980, and some reporter in New Hampshire asked him, who do you got in the Super Bowl? Now, in the Super Bowl, I had to look this up. In the Super Bowl in 1980, it was kind of funny. Why'd I have to look it up? Because I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. But in 1980, the Pittsburgh Steelers were playing the L.A. Rams. And so the reporter says, who do you got in the Super Bowl, Governor? Reagan, and he says, oh, definitely LA. Then he remembered that he wasn't candidating for the governor of California. He was a presidential hopeful, so he said, oh, well, whatever let the best team wins. You know, he didn't care about California anymore. It's interesting how loyalties change, how fickle they are. That it's whatever's going to get me ahead, whatever's going to make, I like Reagan, by the way, but he just got thrown under the bus in my sermon. Sorry, rest in peace. Yikes. It sounded good on the planning. Anyways, it doesn't matter. All for the glory of God, amen? Now I throw myself off. I distract myself. So loyalty and allegiances and devotions can be a funny thing. Here's the thing. 75 men show up from Israel to Babylon. 75 people that were young and intelligent and strong and loved God. But at this point in the story, 3 chapters in, there's only 4 that are standing firm. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. And so Nebuchadnezzar's looking for uncontested loyalty. Surrender to this huge golden statue, and there are 3 young men standing in a sea of people. Here's what I want to tell you. 3 things. Number 1, a faith that has been tested is a faith that can be trusted. That's exactly what we see first and foremost in this passage. That these men knew their faith. They believed in God. They trusted in God. They were devoted to God. But what we realize is that a faith that it can be trusted is a faith that is tested. If your faith has never been tested, it's not something that can be trusted. Think about that. How have you in your life been tested in your faith? If you've been tested, you have a faith that can be trusted. These boys were all about their faith. And they knew that Nebuchadnezzar was not going to put up with disobedience. And so as everyone's kneeling and everyone's bowing down, the 3 men are standing, and whether or not they were actually seen by Nebuchadnezzar, we're not sure. But there are these guys in verses 8 through 12, a bunch of tattletales disguised as loyal to the king. They kind of run up to the king and say, hey, guess what? I know you have this decree. I know that you feel like you have to have total allegiance. There's these 3 guys, and they didn't do it. They didn't do it. You better find them out. And they start complaining. But I feel in many ways they're just furious and upset because these men have been elevated above them. They were jealous. And so in verses 13 through 15, we see that Nebuchadnezzar calls Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in, and he says, listen, do you understand the consequences of what you're about to follow through on? If you don't bow down, you're going to the fiery furnace. And he finds them to be unshakable in their faith. I mean, they could have rationalized. They could have done it and then felt guilty in the morning and said sorry to God. Church, I wonder in your life, how has your faith been tested? And how firm were you able to stand? I'm wondering if this is one of the reasons why bad things happen to good people. To test our faith. Because a faith that is trusted is a faith that has been tested. We will all have opportunities to compromise what we know to be true. We will have opportunity to decide who the audience and what the quantity is. Who is the audience of our worship? If the audience is one and it's God, then our devotion and our allegiance will be to God. If our audience and our devotion is the world and the culture and the expectations and the external, then we will then follow that. What I find very interesting in this passage, basically, he's demanding allegiance. He's been demanding everyone bow down. Everyone bows down except these 3. And then he calls them together and he says, listen, are you sure you want to do this? Why are you not bowing down? Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. Now come on. They couldn't do anything better than that. They're basically saying, we got nothing to say. We're guilty. Guilty as charged. Not really anything to say. There's no explanation. They're simply confident in God without any real concern for the external. Church, they didn't have to pray about their obedience. They didn't have to fast about their obedience. They didn't have to think about their obedience. They didn't have some dramatic episode about their obedience. They didn't need to post it on Facebook and hopefully get 47 likes and comments in a shameless attempt to draw ridiculous attention to themselves. There wasn't anything about it. They said, listen, this is who we are. This is what we do. We don't need a lot of fanfare. We don't need to give you a lot of explanation. This is who we are. We have simply are going to be obedient to God. We're going to obey God instead of following people. A faith that can be trusted is a faith that's been tested, church. Number 2, faith standing firm despite what it sees. That's when we stand firm, we have faith despite what we see. Look with me in verse 17 and 18 of this passage. We begin to see the consequences of their obedience. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of God you have set up. So basically, to give us a little bit more explanation of what they believe and what they think. Now, I think it's fascinating. And this is where we want to pause and not miss something that I think is really, really important. They believe that not only is God able to save them, they believe that God is willing to save them. But they also believe that they're going to have faith even if he doesn't save them. I mean, I've often said that our God is able and our God is willing. But are we able to take it even beyond that? That we believe God is able, we believe God is willing, but we also believe even if he doesn't. Because I think sometimes our faith gets a little shaky when it gets out where maybe he doesn't show up. When he does or if he doesn't, we believe God is still on the throne. See, it's easy, church, to create confidence in here. When we're together in here, we all have great faith. I mean, think about it. I've in my own life, when we're standing here, man, we are like spiritual giants. Like, man, this is awesome. I'll take on the world. How many people leave a church on Sunday morning thinking, I'm going to take on the world? Like, I am going to take on the world. I got faith. I'm ready to go. Prices pump me up. Let's take the world, right? But when the crowd changes, see, no longer are we with everyone that we hang around with at church, where we get all this great faith energy, then tomorrow we'll be surrounded by a different crowd and we'll be in the minority. Right now we're in the majority. But tomorrow we'll be in the minority. The crowd will change. And our faith will be required to be lived out. How many believe that it's different to have faith in a church building than faith in a doctor's office when you're about to get a different report? It's easy to have faith here and now. It's difficult to have faith in the doctor's office when the door's opening up and the test results are coming. It's different about believing in your house church and believing in the lunchroom at school. Amen? Demonstrating your faith in the lunchroom is a little bit than demonstrating your faith in the house church. How about it's different demonstrating your faith at home in an unbelieving household than believing in the household of God? It's different when we have to believe when we look at our checkbook and the numbers don't add up than believing when we look at the blessings. Man, you look at this like, this is unbelievable. God is awesome. Look what he did here. And then we go and we look at our numbers in our checkbook and we're thinking, do I still believe? I mean, it's easy to believe on your wedding day, right? I mean, God is for my marriage. But you're married 16 years and you're thinking, God, do I still have as much faith as I had on my first day? See, it's easy to have faith in some times, in some places, in some spaces. And sometimes it's more difficult. And so listen, don't get lost in the fiery furnace like, oh, well, listen, those clowns, they were in a fire. Well, I'm never going to be in a fiery furnace. You know what the point of this story is. You know that there is testing and there's trials and there's temptations. And you know in your life there's a different definition of a fire. And whether or not we're going to stand firm in it is the question of the morning. Because it's easy to stand firm today, here, and now. But when you're in the fiery furnace, whatever that furnace is for you, can you stand firm? Because I want you to know that God is not only able, but He is willing to help. He's willing to deliver. He's willing to protect. He's willing to provide. He's willing to heal. He's willing to restore. He's willing to love. He's willing to correct. Whether He does or doesn't is God's business. Whether He does or doesn't is God's business, church. What the scriptures tell us in Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Although our circumstances changes, although our feelings change, although our circumstances and feelings differ, God never changes. Ephesians 3 tells us that I pray that out of His glorious riches He may strengthen you with power through His Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the saints to know His love and His surpassing knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. To Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we could ask or imagine, according to His power that is at work within us. Church, what if God doesn't do what we are asking and wanting Him to do? What if He doesn't save those 3 men in the fiery furnace that day? What if we're asking for a healing and the person dies? What if we're asking for God to save our home and we have to move? What if we're asking God to restore our relationship and it ends? What if we're asking for a healing for this addiction and it continues to make our lives hell on earth? Church, we must stand firm. A faith that has been tested is a faith that can be trusted. A faith, we need to have faith to stand firm despite what we see. These men knew that the fiery furnace was the consequence for disobedience to Nebuchadnezzar. But they understood this third principle that I want to share with you. Faithfulness is our responsibility. The outcome is God's. Now, I'm not going to say that's easy. It's easy to preach. It's just not easy to live. Faithfulness is our responsibility, and the outcome is God's. We need to realize that there are a definite, distinct role that we have and a distinct role that God has. There is definitely a place where our role ends and God's role picks up. These boys did not know the end of the story. They didn't have the privilege of Sunday school to realize that they get saved. They were in it. They were trusting God through it. And their responsibility was faithfulness, and God's responsibility was the outcome. And so all they could do was stand firm. And as we read through the story, we realize that lots of things happen. They get basically tied up. They get thrown into the fiery furnace. And King Nebuchadnezzar goes into his owner's box and he's observing the blast furnace bowl. And they were in the middle of the fire. What do you do in the middle of the fire? What do we do in the middle of the fire? Is that when we begin to get compromised? Is that when we begin to take shortcuts? Is that when we begin to no longer trust? 1 Peter 1:7 in the New Living Translation says it this way: these trials will show that your faith is genuine. These trials, these fires, these circumstances, these external pressures will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold. Though your faith is far more precious than mere gold, so when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. Church, the reason why we have trials is that we might be tested, and that our faith may be found genuine. When you go through trials, it will show your makeup. So can I share with you what happened at the end of this fiery furnace? Nebuchadnezzar has the big statue. Everyone bows down except these three. Nebuchadnezzar calls them in and says, listen, if you're not going to bow down, I'm going to throw you in the fiery furnace. They say, listen, we're guilty. Throw us in. We're trusting God. Whether or not he saves us or not, we trust him. So they get the strongest men in the government. They tie up these three guys. They throw them into the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar sits down to watch them burn. But what happens? Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, O king. Verse 25, he said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. Not 3 men, but 4. No longer bound, but free. Not burned up, but unharmed. The only thing, interesting to note, the only thing that's burned up, what's the only thing that's burned up in this episode in the fiery furnace? Yes, the only thing that was burned up is that which was binding them. Now, I think that's extremely, really something we need to pause and think about. What if the very thing that we long to be delivered from is the very thing that gives us freedom? Now, I don't even fully understand what I'm saying, but I see it in this story. The very thing that they wanted to be delivered from was the very thing that gave them freedom. It was the very mechanism that gave them freedom. A helper was sent into the fire. They were delivered through the trial, not necessarily out of the trial. I mean, wouldn't it be a different story if they like right before they were going to get thrown in, God sends an angel and says, "No, don't throw them in." No, what happened was they actually were delivered through the fire, not out of it, because God wanted to teach them something about himself and about themselves through the trial. Maybe, church, we need to change our prayer life. Instead of asking to be delivered from things, we need to be asking God to deliver us through things. Because he wants, as in this story, he wants to send a helper. He wants to send a helper into the fire. God has something he wants to show you about yourself and about himself through the trial. And he won't do it without fire. It's very interesting as we end this story in verses 26, 27, 28, how Nebuchadnezzar again changes his mind about the one true God, and he begins to talk about how this God is an amazing God and how we need to follow him. But what I want you to know is that God did not necessarily show up in the furnace to impress Nebuchadnezzar. He did not show up in the fire in order to bring Nebuchadnezzar closer to himself. I do not think this was an evangelistic story. This wasn't about Nebuchadnezzar. This was about seeing and recognizing the obedience of his servants. God shows up in that fire because those men were faithful to him. Some of you may have seen the movie Fireproof. Great movie, should watch it. But one of the quotes in there is this: Fireproof doesn't mean that a fire will never come. It means that when the fire comes, you will be able to withstand it. I'm going to tell you right now, there is a very big difference between religion and a true relationship with God. If you have religion, if you're trying to check the boxes with God, when you go into a fire, you will get burned. And so today, in this safe environment, if you're sleeping, you want to wake up, because this will probably be the first good thing I say all sermon, but you want to come into this safe place, because I don't think anybody's on fire right now. Maybe you're lusting after the lady in front of you or something, but other than that, nobody's on fire right now. So this is safe. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to check the tag on your fireproof material. Because if you wait to get in the fire, if you wait till Tuesday afternoon, you're going to get burned up. You need to make sure today that you got fireproof Christianity. You never see a firefighter looking at his tag before he goes, like he's in the fire. He's like, look, like, is this fireproof? Like, is this going to keep me from getting burned up? No, because he knows. He knows that it's fireproof. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they knew that their relationship with God was fireproof. And so when Nebuchadnezzar's threatening the fiery furnace, they don't sweat it at all, because they know there's nothing that there's nothing that external pressure expectations could ever put on them that would make them move in their faith. And so they enter into whatever circumstances the world has for them, because they know they're going to be faithful. They know they're going to be true to God. And so today the challenge is this. Take time today in this safe environment, without the fires raging around you that you know are coming this week, and shore up the fireproof. If you're here today and you have never ever realized that you needed to be fireproof, you basically have lived a life of difficulties and failures and really just wondering why you can't figure out why you keep getting burned. I want you to know that Jesus Christ is the fireproof. He's that which makes us fireproof. He is that which allows us to have confidence in trials. Because Jesus Christ has died on the cross and he defeated death, and there's nothing that this world can do to harm us, to steal us, to hinder us. And so as we end this series, I think it's good that we ended with this story. Because the bottom line is this, church. We have a faith that can withstand the troubles of this world. We will have troubles. There will be troubles. There will be stress. There will be anxiety. But we can know today that we can withstand it. And so as your takeaway from this message, I pray that you take away confidence in God. As we've looked at Daniel and now his three friends this week, I pray that you would take away confidence that there is nothing that you will encounter through faith in God you can't overcome. That's the story of Daniel. Trusting God to stand out, stand up, stand strong, stand firm. Stand. When everything else is saying sit. When everything else is saying compromise. When everything else is saying you won't be able to do it on your own. You say, listen, I'm trusting in God.